It's to start with what you know. And so when you start thinking about your family history, it will feel completely overwhelming, right? How do you begin to sift through however many generations you're feeling called to sift through, right? Where do you start? And so I think our big idea here is that you start with what you know. What are the stories that are at the forefront of your mind? What stories have been told and retold so many times that you could recount them to, your neighbor or your child without even thinking about it, and then start to think of those other stories maybe that aren't as well known but still come to mind, and write those down and recount as much as you can, even if they're incomplete. Then start identifying some of your earliest stories. And through this process, you'll begin to think of other stories that pop up. That's just how it is. So really, it's really about a time of thinking back and writing down the stories, not incomplete, but just jotting down, oh, this story, this is a great story. And maybe even jotting down next to it, the importance of the story is A, B, and C. So, and I would imagine, Dave, that as you begin to write down those stories and what the gist of them is, it's going to pique your curiosity, like, oh, but what really happened there? Who was with my dad in that moment? Or what was he doing before that? Or was he in, school at that time? Or where did they live? All of a sudden, you'll start to have all these questions that you'll want to then go and dig deeper for.
Yeah. And what I love about this point is starting with what you know, it will suddenly thrust you forward into the project, because the moment you start writing down stories, you'll start thinking, oh, that person's still alive. And we have our next point is about conducting research, but not that I'm going to jump to that, but you'll start to, it'll start to give you some direction. I was just thinking, I was with my father, who is actually just turns 88 this month, and both he and my mom are 88. And we went down we have some land in South Dakota. And so he likes to take me down there and, tell me the old stories, about everything. And we were in this pasture, which we call it the Tower Pasture. And it's just, it has one of the high points in the area. And we found out that it's where the Sioux Indians would camp. There's circles there in the area, as well as, and they would camp on the top because it was this high point that they could look around almost 360 degrees and watch out and notice if there were any people coming or going, or maybe it was bison, I don't know. But while we were down there in this pasture, I was reminded again when Uncle Johnny, would have been my great Uncle Johnny, died in World War II. And my grandmother, so this would have been in 1944, was notified, imagine rural America, right? So she was notified by a neighbor who had been to town. Town is maybe 40, 50 people, maybe 100 people. But they had been to town and there was news at the post office. So this person went to the farm, and my dad was there when this neighbor told my grandmother that her brother was killed in a foxhole in France. And so now, if my father had not been alive, but he just talked the grief, the weeping, and the sadness, the wailing, that Uncle Johnny had been killed in World War II. So, but I remember him telling me that. And if he had not been alive, I would have had that question, like who actually told you that Uncle Johnny died? Did the army come out? But it had been done through the Postal Service. If I remember correctly, I might not be remembering that correctly, but I do remember that a neighbor was the one who told my grandmother, because she was not the parent, right? She was the sister. So all that to say, I think Uncle Johnny was a half brother to her. So these, when you say start with what you know, you start with some of these stories, and then that will lead you and will give you some really good impetus.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Dave, do you want to talk about our final point number 7?
Well, this one is determine what is too personal.
So did I
So
just violate that by talking about my grandfather?
no, I thought it was great.
So, right. He's
It's a
dead,
great
so
it's a great segue, right? It's a great segue.
back
The
to my
moment,
grandfather, though. Back to my grandfather. The other story that I have about him, he was a very disturbed man, but his brothers, when he passed away, said, yeah, Paul, he would sit um, on top of the barn and he would hold his breath until he passed out. And he would literally pass out. He was just an off man, right? And so you connect that with all this other behavior down the road, and you're thinking he probably had some undiagnosed anxiety disorder or depression, which then in the context of my life helps make sense of, some of my own issues that I've dealt with, oh, maybe it comes from the Hobblitzel side, right? So anyway, all that to say, every family has those stories of brokenness. Maybe it's alcoholism or depression, divorce, mental illness, rape, as in possibly your case, Dave, of your family, tragedy, affairs. I mean, every family has those. And some of those things you might not feel comfortable sharing, and maybe you shouldn't share because it could paint the living in a very unflattering way. And you don't want to damage family relationships. You want to bring your family closer together, right?
I think so. I think the last thing you'd want to do is to write your family story and have everybody hate you and avoid the next family reunion. So,
No, I don't like family reunions that much.
yeah, well, maybe it's a good reason not, to make sure you don't have to go to the next one. I do think anytime you lay down a sentence, right, whether you're writing a memoir, whether you're writing nonfiction, whatever it is you're writing, or whether what we're talking about, but writing your family story, you're making choices about what you keep and what you don't keep in on that writing. You're making choices because you're putting these words into the real world on printed page. And so you do have to determine what is too personal. I'm going to tell the heroic stories. I'm going to tell the story of discovering the 400 samples, DNA samples that were used for this study that, had a vectoring effect both on women's lives, but also on my brother's career. But I'm not going to say this other thing. I have nothing in mind. I'm not saying there's something else, but I'm just saying you're making decisions about because it's about storytelling and story writing. What stories stay in and what stories don't go in. And I think you have to make that judgment. And sometimes I think it's not easy. I think it gets back to your purpose, right? What is your purpose for writing this story of your family, and making sure that you stay true to that as you make decisions on what to cut, what to keep, and what to tell.
I think memoirs typically include more non-flattering stories because they're funneled through your perspective. And so I think that people allow for that more, like, well, that's through her perspective, right? And it's what people expect often in memoirs, something a little salacious, something a little tangy, right? So, but if you, like you said, if you don't want to hurt your family, if you don't want to cause division in your family, then maybe don't include those unflattering stories. Maybe
Can I
save
give
them.
you
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I give you two salacious anecdotes from people who've gone through and done the DNA ancestry.com? So my wife has a friend who did it and found out she had a half sister. So her father would frequent this diner, and come to find out that he had an affair with a waitress at this diner, and she had a half brother.
Whoa.
So and so of course that narrative came out after both her mom and dad were dead, and I don't even know why I'm telling these stories other than their family stories. Another story is good friends of mine, both Jana and me. Her father was a pastor, right? And so they knew that that he had been unfaithful to her mom through the years, even as a pastor, right? She knew this, but when she did the ancestry.com DNA thing, she found she had a half sister from when he was in high school. So he fought in the Korean War. And so nobody knows what really happened. Did he get her pregnant and then suddenly have to leave? Or did he get her pregnant, know about it, and then left because he wanted to escape it? Or did he never know that he had a child with her? So all of a sudden she gets this email out of the blue. Hey, I found you on blah, blah, blah. I realized we've got X amount of DNA. That means that we're closely related. We're, half siblings. So anyway, so anytime you start to think about telling your family story, you do have to make decisions about what is the purpose, what goes in, what doesn't go in, and how do I want to tell that story?
I think you said it best, Dave, when you said, are the stories elemental to understanding your family history? I think that's a great question to gauge it. Are they elemental? Do they are they necessary so you understand fully your family history, or are they just there because maybe it is a little bit saucy, right? And and
Right, right.
you have a grudge against somebody and you want to call them out, but is that really going to be beneficial in the long run? And is it really necessary for people to understand your family history? So that's kind of a negative note to end on. I feel like we need to end positive.
Yeah. Let's circle back and say, I think we only say that because of the great responsibility that you have when you make that decision to write your family story. It's pretty heavy. And since very few people are going to do that in your family, it's a great responsibility. And I do think your purpose needs to be so clear, and your audience needs to be so clear. And if it is to harm the family, you really need to write fiction and not do that. I think, I'm a big advocate of, as I've gotten older, to really protect the family relationships and to preserve that as much as possible. So I do think we would never want to talk about writing your family story as some sort of means to hurt your family, but really to ennoble your family, to inspire your family, to encourage your family. When I think of all the stories on both my mom and my dad's side, just their heroism, how fierce they were. I want my kids to know that.
Yeah. And that is a great note to end on. And if you can be part of that, what a wonderful thing you can do for your family.